Hello, my name is Ruth Fortis, and in this PowerPoint presentation, we're going to talk about rubrics. What is a rubric? A rubric is a tool that is used to rate student performance. It has the potential to help a teacher provide formative assessment during the teaching and/or learning process by clearly establishing his or her standards and quality expectations. Now, we briefly discussed rubrics in the module on performance assessment, but here we're going to, because rubrics are so important, we're going to go into them in depth in this presentation. Now, rubrics allow students to gain a clear understanding of the teacher's standards and expectations, thus increasing their potential for success. And let me just point out that, first of all, the teacher has to clarify to himself or herself what are those standards and expectations, and the rubric helps you do that. It enables teachers to give students specific and immediate feedback effectively and efficiently, and we'll see, depending on the type of rubric, exactly what sort of feedback you can or cannot give. And it gives students the opportunity to practice self-reliance, self-assessment, and self-direction. And I should mention that the reason a rubric helps them do that is that a rubric is not intended only for the teacher's use. A rubric is also intended for the student's use. It may not exactly be an identical rubric that you use for teachers and students, but every task you give, every performance assessment task you give has to have a student-designed rubric as well. So, a rubric is a scoring tool that sets out, these are the elements of the rubric, okay? It sets out the required dimensions for the task and defines them. It indicates the weight that you give to each dimension, and it describes what performance looks like at different levels. I truly believe that rubrics are at the heart of good performance assessment. If you're somehow, when you make the rubric, it demands that you clarify your thinking and explain to yourself exactly what it is that you're doing in this task. And if you are somehow a bit fuzzy or not clear on that, then the performance task won't work well. So in the following slides, we're going to talk about the differences between analytic rubrics and holistic rubrics, and we'll learn how to create a rubric for a performance task, and we'll use the Bryson task as an example. So these are the different kinds of rubric. Okay, there's an analytic rubric, and there's a holistic rubric. Now, analytic rubrics, you have a number of dimensions, and you score them separately. This allows you to get and to give to the student diagnostic information. In other words, in what skills is the student doing better, and in what skills is the student doing not so good. A holistic rubric, you also have dimensions in a holistic rubric, but the scoring, you grade them, the feedback you give is on the student work as a whole. Okay, so there's no information provided on specific skills. Now, a holistic rubric is less time-consuming and less expensive to use. Expensive in the sense that if you're rating lots and lots of rubrics, you can do it, if you're rating lots and lots of tasks, then you can do it quicker and thus more cheaply with a holistic rubric. Which rubric you choose basically depends on what your reason is. If you recall from the previous section, performance assessment is designed for a particular reason. Now, if your purpose, for example, is just to group students or to select students for a particular course, this can be done based on a holistic score. But if you want to diagnose individual needs, or if you want to certify minimum competencies, or if you just want to give your students more detailed feedback, then you need to be using an analytic rubric. Now here is an example of an analytic rubric. I found this on the website. It is an example of how you rate chocolate chip cookies. Now, if you look on the left-hand column, you have the dimensions. There are 5 dimensions being rated here. The number of chocolate chips in each cookie, the texture of the cookie, the color of the cookie, the taste of the cookie, and the richness of the cookie. Those are the dimensions. Across the top, you have your rating scale. There are 4 points on this rating scale. Delicious, good, needs improvement, and poor. Now you can give your feedback in terms of words. You can say, I gave a rating of a 4, of delicious, or you can also add a numerical value to that. You can say 4 points is delicious, 3 points is good, and so on. What you have in the cells in the middle are the performance standards. That tells you what performance you expect in each cell. For example, if you're looking at the dimension of the number of chocolate chips, in order to get a rating of delicious, you expect to find a chocolate chip in every bite. If you don't have a chocolate chip in every bite, then you can't give the rating of delicious. If you have chocolate chips in about 75% of the bites, then you can give a rating of good, and so on and so forth. For example, if we look at the color, if the cookie is burned, okay, then you have to give the rating of poor, okay? And if we look at, let's say, the dimension of taste, if it tastes like a quality cookie but a store-bought cookie, then it gets the rating of good. So again, in the cells, you have a description of what you see in reality, not your, okay, it's the standard for a particular dimension with a particular rating. Okay, now another thing I want to say is when you're thinking about how many dimensions you need, it's very important to be able to make a distinction between 2 dimensions. Okay, now I personally, as I said, I found this on the internet. I didn't create this rubric myself, but I was just wondering to myself if I could really differentiate between taste, the dimension of taste, and the dimension of richness. Now, maybe there are, people who are gourmets with regard to chocolate chip cookies, and they can say, well, of course there's a difference between the taste and the richness, and all power to them, but I'm not sure that for me, the richness isn't part of the taste. And one way to think about that is whether you can separate dimensions is whether a product, in this case a cookie, can be high on one dimension but low on the other. For example, can you have a cookie that gets a rating of delicious and on taste, okay? In other words, has that home-baked taste, but could have a rating of poor on richness, in other words, non-fat contents. Can something have non-fat contents and have a home-baked taste? Maybe yes, maybe no. But when you're thinking about the dimensions, try and see if you can define each one separately, or if there's not some kind of dependency between them. So the analytic rubric for rating a chocolate chip cookie, this is just to sum it up, has 5 dimensions: the number of chips, texture, color, taste, richness. There are 4 performance levels or scaling points. delicious, good, needs improvement, poor. And when you use an analytic rubric, for each dimension, you give a separate score. So you end up with 5 different scores. Now, you can sum those up together or average them out for a global rating for the cookie. But if we're talking, if you want to go back to the person who made the cookies, you have that information available. You can say, well, the texture, color, taste, and richness were wonderful, but you need to use more chocolate chips because I only got a chocolate chip in 50% of my bites. This is an example of a holistic rubric. Now note that we have here 4 rating points. Okay, we have the cookie can be delicious, it can be good, it can be needs improvement, or poor. When you rate something holistically, you only give one score. You either give a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4. Okay, you could maybe give a 2.5 or a 3.75, but basically you're only giving 1 score per cookie. Unlike the analytic rubric where you gave a score for each dimension, here you're only giving 1 score overall. And what you have under each rating point is a description, the performance standards of what constitutes a delicious cookie. Okay, there is a chocolate chip in every bite. It is chewy, golden brown, has home-baked taste, and a rich, creamy, high-fat flavor. And so on and so forth for the other points on the scale. Now, what happens when you're rating holistically is you might say, well, yeah, the cookie was chewy, it was golden brown, it had home-baked taste, and it was rich and creamy, but there weren't enough chocolate chips in every bite. So then you have to use your judgment as to whether that cookie still deserves a rating of 4. Perhaps there was another dimension on which it was not so delicious. But basically what you're doing here is you're using your judgment. You're looking at the cookie as a whole, and you're deciding, I think that was more of a 3 and it doesn't deserve a 4. Or if you find that hard to choose, you can say, all right, it was a 3.5. But you are not rating every dimension separately. That's the main issue in a holistic rubric. To sum up, each performance level is described as a whole, and one single rating is given that considers all aspects of the cookie together. Now, don't you wish that rating student products was as enjoyable as rating cookies? So now we're going to go on to more job-related scoring issues. So again, the elements of a scoring rubric are dimensions, definitions, scale of values, and performance standards. We're going to go over the different parts now, and we're going to be using an actual task given to students, which is the Bryson task. Now, we're going to focus here on analytic rubrics. I'm not going to talk anymore about holistic rubrics. But again, the concept is the same. You have to define, you have to state your definitions, your dimensions, define them, make a scale of values, and the performance standards. The only difference is that there are no separate ratings per dimension. So let's create a rubric for the Bryson task. It appears in Unit 2 of this module. The task description and the relevant can-do statements are presented in the document entitled A Sample Performance Task for the Upper Intermediate Level. And you might find it convenient to have the task in front of you as we work. Now, the rubric for the Bryson task has been adapted from the generic rubric for assessing writing at the upper intermediate level. If you want to see this rubric, the generic rubric, it's in the generic rubrics folder under resources of this unit. The generic rubrics provide general guidelines for rating writing tasks. However, because they're so general, they must be adapted according to the context of the particular task that you're administering. Now, if you want, you can take the rubric for the Bryson task and compare it later with the generic one to see what changes were made. Most of the changes were made in the dimension of content, but not solely. And for your convenience, directly below this PowerPoint file in Unit 3, you'll find the Bryson task with the rubric that was created. Okay, so the first element of a rubric is the dimensions. The dimensions are the behaviors or attributes that serve as the basis for judging the product. And in the case of the Bryson task, we have defined 5 dimensions: content, coherence, vocabulary, mechanics, and sociolinguistic competence. Now, the dimensions you choose should be directly related to the can-do statements you have chosen to work with. Now, if you recall, we had 7 can-do statements, so it's not that each dimension reflects one can-do statement. They have to be sort of juggled around and tied together to produce the best possible fit. How many dimensions to use? Well, if you do use one dimension per can-do statement and you have a lot of can-do statements, you might end up with too many dimensions and you'll find it cumbersome to rate them all. Or, as in the example of the taste and richness in the cookie, you might find it difficult to separate them and to rate each one separately. On the other hand, if you define too few dimensions, you might be losing information by lumping things together that don't really belong together. So you have to use your judgment. What exactly is the right number of dimensions so that you don't lose information, but you don't start having a too cumbersome rubric. Now, after you've decided on how many dimensions you want to use, you have to define them. This is a crucial step. Now, dimensions are typically defined as an ability. Okay, when you say what's in a dimension, when you define it, you have to say how you understand the content of that particular dimension. Now, they are not descriptions of the highest performance level. For example, if we look at content here, it does not say can write a formal letter of invitation, etc., etc. It says the ability to write. Why is that? If you say the ability to write a formal letter of invitation, blah, 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 the ability can be high, average, or low. So you want to take the product that the student has given you and rate it and say, is that particular student's ability high, average, or low? If your definition says can write a formal letter of invitation, and let's say the student can't, well, what do? Your definition doesn't include that product. It's a little bit of a semantic differentiation, but it's important to understand that the definition of the dimension is a general ability, which can be high or low. The performance standards, when we get to them, and we'll talk about those in just a few slides, the performance standards are where you describe absolutes, okay? So dimensions are defined as abilities. Now, they should not, however, be vague and abstract, and they should contain all the elements that you think are important in the dimension of content. For example, here we have the ability to write a formal letter of invitation. That's sort of a general introduction. But now we get to the nitty-gritty. What do we want to see in this formal letter of invitation? We want to have some part that introduces the letter writer. We want to have an invitation to the addressee to attend a conference and give a talk. We want to have a part that requests an interview with the addressee. And we want the letter to provide a list of questions. Okay, so all of these things together have to be in the formal letter of invitation. And to get a high score, they should all be there. And coherence, for example, we have the ability to create a formal letter by making use of correct paragraphing, a number of cohesive devices. These two things, the use of these two aspects, should result in a clear and coherent piece of writing. So what we want is we want a clear and coherent formal letter, and we achieve that by making use of correct paragraphing and a number of cohesive devices. Okay, now the names of the dimensions, content and coherence, can be defined in a million different ways for different tasks, and even for the same task, different teachers will define content or coherence differently. The reason it's so important to be precise and detailed in your definitions is that if another teacher is going to be using this rubric, then they have to understand exactly what you meant when you said content and what you meant when you said coherence. The clearer the rubric, the more detailed and specified the dimensions are, the easier it's going to be for other people to use the rubric, if other people will be using it, but also for yourself. It helps you define exactly what you mean when you say, oh, that letter has really good content. Break it down for yourself. Think of exactly what you want to see in a letter with good content. Here are 3 other definitions for the Bryson task. Vocabulary is the ability to use a range of vocabulary appropriate to a formal letter. Now, you may want, if in your class you've taught specific vocabulary that you want to have appear, then you can add a bit here, the ability to use a range of vocabulary appropriate to a formal letter as taught in class, if you want specific things to appear. Mechanics is the ability to use correct grammar. Well, that pretty much covers all of the English language. So you have to specify, what does it mean to use correct grammar in the context of this task? Okay, in particular, question structure. Perhaps that's what you've been teaching, so you want to make sure they can ask questions. Paragraphing format, punctuation, and spelling in a letter format. Okay, so you've narrowed that down a little bit. And sociolinguistic competence is defined here as the ability to use register, which is appropriate to a formal letter of invitation. Okay, so now we've chosen our dimensions and we've defined them. Now we're going to talk about the dimension weights. Okay, weights should be given to the dimensions according to their importance to the task. For example, in the case of the Bryson task, you can ask yourself, is sociolinguistic competence as important as content? And in this case, when we were creating the task, we said absolutely not. Now, students can be involved in this process. You can discuss the rubric with them ahead of time and get their input on what they think counts the most. Do they think vocabulary is the most important, mechanics, content? This would depend on your teaching style, how much you want to involve the students, but it's certainly an option you might want to consider. Now, differential weighting is not obligatory. Okay, if in your task you think all of the dimensions are equally important, then give them all equal weight. But in this particular task, we thought that content was the dimension that was the most important, then coherence, vocabulary, mechanics, social linguistic competence, and you can see the percentages, 30, 25, 20, 20, and 5, that we gave to each dimension according to what we thought was its relative performance. Now, these are the weights. We've kept the weights here that are set out in the generic rubric, the generic writing rubric that I mentioned previously. But again, depending on what you've been working on in class, you are absolutely allowed to change the dimensions to suit you better. The next step is to create rating scales for each dimension. Okay, remember in the chocolate chip cookie example, there were 4 rating points: delicious, good, needs improvement, and poor. So now you have to decide how many points do you want for each dimension. Each point on the scale needs to be well defined. Okay, now if you have a scale with many, many, many points, this may be hard to do. Longer scales, usually, if you're in a high-stakes context, for example, and let's say you've got 2 teachers rating each task, longer scales make it harder to get agreement among scorers. This is called inter-rater reliability, and we'll talk about it in the next PowerPoint presentation. On the other hand, extremely short scales make it difficult to identify small differences between students. Now, if I go back to the cookie rubric, there were 5 dimensions. We said each of them had a 4-point rating scale. Now, if you are a cookie gourmet, you may be able to define, for example, 10 rating points for cookies. For example, it can go from unswallowable to pretty awful, poor, needs improvement, almost good, good, really good, delicious, extremely delicious, and orgasmic. Okay, but for myself, as I said, I'm not a chocolate chip cookie gourmet, so I would probably stick with the 4 scale points. Some other considerations to take into account when you're thinking about how many points to put on the scale. If you want to, let's say, just divide students into 2 or 3 groups based on whether they've, attained the standard, failed to attain the standard, or perhaps exceeded the standard for a particular outcome, then a short scale of 3 levels may be adequate. However, if you want finer distinctions between levels of ability, then you should use a longer scale. Now, in the rating scale for the Bryson task, each dimension has a range of points associated with it. And, for example, the dimension of content has 30 points associated with it. And as we'll see in a second, we broke up the points for each dimension into 5 levels. Okay, for example, the dimension of vocabulary in the Bryson task has 20 points. The 20 points are divided into 5 levels. The first level is 0 to 4 points, the second level 5 to 8, third 9 to 12, 13 to 16, and 17 to 20. Now, when we were creating this rubric, the other rater and I felt comfortable using 20 points for vocabulary. We thought we could pretty much distinguish between, let's say, 13 points and 15 points. So that's what we did. However, if you find that using so many points for a single dimension is confusing or inconvenient, you are most welcome to reduce them and to create a new you could have just a 5-point scale, where excellent is 5, very good is 4, good is 3, needs work is 2, and unsatisfactory, I see I've written here 0. That ought to be 1 point. Or not, you could keep it 0. These things are all up to you to decide. Now we are getting to the performance standards part. If you remember the cookie rubric, we had the dimensions on the left. We've talked about those. We had the scoring points on the top. We've talked about that. And now we're going to get to what goes into the heart of the table, into each little cell there, the performance standards. Now, you have to create a standard for each performance level for each dimension. Okay, and again, the more points you have and the more dimensions you have, the more cells you have to fill in. Now, the standards should describe in detail the characteristics of the performance you expect to see at each level. Okay, so example for the dimension of taste in a cookie. You have to say, what does a delicious cookie taste like? Or what does a good cookie taste like? And so on and so forth. Now, if the task has been administered before, you can provide accompanying real-life examples for each level. In other words, if I'm going to the Bryson task, let's say you gave that task to students in a previous year and you have their products. If you want your students for this year to be able to see what you considered to be a good, average, or low performance, you can give them examples from the previous year. They would probably copy from there, so maybe that's not such a good idea. But if, for example, if you're rating the task this year with a teacher who didn't rate with you last year, then you can show the other teacher examples from the previous year to calibrate your rating so that you're both on the same page, so to speak. Now again, when we were talking about defining the dimensions, remember I said you define dimensions as ability, whether they can be high, average, or low. But performance standards are spot on. In other words, they describe the performance for a particular level of ability. So here we're not talking general abilities, we're talking specific abilities. Now, here we have the performance standards of the Bryson rubric. What's in front of you right now are the performance standards for the dimension of content. And as I said before, we grouped the points into 5 different levels. So I don't have a performance standard for 0, for 1, for 2, and for 3. No, I have a performance standard for the range of points 0 to 6. And then you decide whether the product is best described. You decide the level that best describes the product, and then within that level you can fine-tune it. Let's say giving 4 points rather than, excuse me, rather than 6 points. Okay. I am not, much to your delight, going to read all through this whole bit here. So this is where you sigh with relief. You can find the task with the full rubric for all of the dimensions just under this file in Unit 3. So again, we have here friends. These are the performance standards for mechanics or sociolinguistic competence. We're all finished. You can find, as I said, the complete version of the Bryson task, including the rubric in Unit 3 of this module. And now you can move on to the activity for Unit 3, which is rating 3 letters that were actually written by students who got this task. You'll find that under the section labeled Activities. And when you're finished with that, with rating the letters, underneath there you'll find annotated letters. In other words, these are the same letters that you rated, that another rater and I went over, and you will find our explanations for the ratings we gave to those tasks. But please do the task yourself before you have a look at our annotated ratings. Thank you for your attention.